Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again, and I'm excited to get to some of the questions.
Rob G asks, can myth and narrative home people today in a way it did 1,000 or 5,000 years ago? Nishitani, in Religion and Nothingness, says that Buddhism tends to demythologize cultures it interacts with. Do you have any thoughts
Yeah,
on any of this?
yeah. I mean, depends what I mean, and Nishitani is a profound thinker. I mean, it does and it doesn't. I mean, like when Buddhism goes into Tibet, it doesn't demythologize. It interacts with the shamanic religion there, and it generates a powerful mythology. But the point is also well taken. It also undermines understanding that mythology in a naive, realistic sort of way. Tibetan Buddhism is this is not a criticism. This is just I find it personally very, very challenging to grok. So I guess I mean again I'm in discussion, um, um, not in debate, but there's disagreement in the discussion around this question with many people about narrative. I'll say again, because people keep attributing something to me that I'm not saying. So I'm going to try again. I think narrative is indispensable. You're not going to become a temporally extended moral agent without narrative. I think narrative is indispensable in teaching us how to realize non-logical entity, and share it. I think this is very, very important. Um, Sets of skills and virtues that are needed for responding to the meaning crisis. However, um, narrative, and you can see this in great novels. Albert Camus' The Plague is probably one of the greatest versions. It's funny because you say, well, it's a novel, it's a narrative. Well, read the book. And I, um, I take one of my slogans. I want to learn how to be a saint without God from one of the characters of that book, Teru. But one of the deep points of the plague is how much how impotent the narratives are in the face of the plague, and how people suffer and magnify their suffering because of the narratives, and an ability to drop out of narrative and in a very stoic like fashion. That's what one of the main characters clearly does. Is the only response to something like the plague that preserves one's humanity. I think this is a great work of literature, and it's not the only one. I'm just using this as an example, but it's an exemplary one of the fact that we need to pay attention to the fact that narrative can make things much worse. And I don't mean a particular narrative, because we like to say, well, it's that narrative that makes things worse. But no, the point of the book is that all the narratives, because there is no narrative for the plague. And then you all know why I'm choosing The Plague as the book right now, because of COVID, of course. There is no narrative, and the desperation, silly, fucked up desperation that people on all sides are trying to create a narrative for this is just causing extra death and extra suffering all around, both sides, all sides, etc. And we're not paying attention to that fact. And I think that's what Camus was trying to get us to see with the plague. And so, while I hold narrative, and I do, for the reasons I've given, in very high esteem, I think, and this is one of the problems, and Stoicism wrestled with this, which is why I think Camus turns to Stoicism with the main character. The fact that our narrative isn't capable of dealing with things like the plague. And it spins crazy, because you can be in the very best narrative of the world. I just saw this on a TV show, and it was like, when my partner and I were watching it, we were just shocked when it happened. This person's in love and found the love of a life. He steps into the traffic and a car hits him and he dies stupidly. No great, nothing, to no purpose, to no moral education, to no completion of the narrative, to no satisfaction of any of this. This is of course, one of the big, claims of Buddhism, that you have to break people out of the narrative with the koan. And I would say it's also part of Jesus of Nazareth's use of the parable, breaking people out of the narrative. Because for all of its great benefits, the narrative also can be one of the greatest of the idols. And so I worry, like I said, and you could hear, I'm sorry, the anger in my voice around COVID about this. I worry that we're heading into kinds of meta crises in which we grab for basically the Paleolithic, Upper Paleolithic transition, the Paleolithic psychotechnology of narrative, and I think we should, I don't want to pronounce, so I'll caution. I think we need to seriously consider the possibility that it will make things worse. It will make things worse. So opening people up to the trans narrative, I think it is very important right now. I think what we need to do is to remind people that they need a place from which, and they do it without realizing it, a place from which they generate narratives, and a place from which they compare and evaluate narratives. It is not self a narrative. That's one of the places, and I just talked to him today, and again we expressed our deep respect and affection for each other. But this is one of the places where I disagree with Paul. Just like I think that which binds all of the aspects together in the multi-aspectual moreness of a thing is not yet another aspect. I think that which generates all narratives and allows us to move from one narrative to the other or compare narratives is not itself another narrative, because we're just getting into an infinite regress. And so I think we need to move into that place from which we make those judgments and from which we generate narratives in order to ask the question that has been asked by Robert, which is, are we really sure that the narrative, our narrative capacity is what we should be relying on to try and grok what's happening right now? I don't deny that if people are going to do it, but I think the question is a profound question, and it needs to be answered with true responsibility, because the question is questioning whether or not we should rely or suppose, maybe that's a better way of putting it, suppose that our narrative capacities are equal to the task we are facing. Yeah, one of the things, like I said, that has sort of added fuel to my fire is precisely the narrative frenzy around COVID. Again, not one side or the other, all sides, and how you can make a good case again on both sides that this has just caused extra suffering and extra death. And so I think the question needs to be heard very deeply. I know a lot of people in this community, people that I respect here, disagree with me, but I think maybe pause the disagreement long enough to hear the depth from which the question was being asked, because I think the very possibility of the question being asked seriously needs to be recognized. So that's what I'll say about that.
Saruman believes that it is only great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. I found it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love. Why, Bilbo Baggins? Perhaps it is because I'm afraid. But it gives me courage.